They told Nayib Bukele to leave, expecting him to get angry. His response left the entire restaurant silent. Nayib Bukele parked his truck in front of Café San Miguel, a modest restaurant in the heart of a small Salvadoran town. It was the kind of place that had been serving homemade food for decades, with a flashing neon sign and the aroma of freshly made pupusas and strong coffee escaping through the door every time someone entered or left. He had been told about the place earlier that day. A local assured him that the best breakfasts were served there and that the owner still prepared the food with his own hands. Bukele was exhausted. It had been a long day of meetings, greetings, and public policy conversations. All he wanted was a quiet meal before continuing on his way. The bell over the door rang as he entered. The place was small but cozy, or so it seemed at first. It was the kind of restaurant where the same customers occupied the same tables every night, where a wall full of faded photos showed decades of diners and employees. The air was permeated with the smell of freshly made tortillas and pot coffee, while the murmur of conversations filled the air. Bukele glanced at the young woman behind the counter. She was about to smile until she recognized him. It was a fleeting moment, but he noticed a flash of doubt on her face, as if she suddenly didn't know what to do. Her lips pressed into a thin line. He glanced around. A few customers had turned their heads in his direction. One man, half a mouthful from his plate, leaned over and whispered something to the person in front of him. Another, a woman in a plaid shirt, set her coffee cup down on the table with a louder than normal thump. Her eyes narrowed just barely before she averted her gaze. Bukele was not naive. He'd been in enough places to recognize when he wasn't entirely welcome. But here, in a simple cafe, the young woman behind the counter hesitated before stepping forward, tucking a lock of hair behind her ear. "Good evening," she said in a cautious voice. "Are you eating here or to go?" Bukele let out a slight tired laugh. "I'm going to eat here if that's not a problem." Another silence, this time too long for such a simple question. She glanced over her shoulder toward the kitchen and then back at him. "I need to check something quickly. One moment, please." She disappeared behind the swinging door. Bukele stood there. Around him, a few people murmured. A man sitting at the bar shifted in his seat. Someone mumbled something under his breath. Something was not right. The seconds dragged on. From the kitchen, voices rose and fell, too muffled to make out the words. Bukele exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders back. He wasn't going to make a fuss, nor was he going to make assumptions. Maybe there was a policy of the place. Maybe there was understaffing that night. Maybe the young woman returned. This time, she didn't seem indecisive. She seemed determined. "I'm sorry, sir," she said in a firmer voice. "We can't serve you tonight." But the way she said it, the way the air in the room seemed to tense with her words, made it clear that this was not a business matter. It was personal. For a brief moment, Nayib Bukele said nothing. His words hovered between them, heavy, like a statement that needed no explanation. The restaurant fell silent, not completely, but enough. In the kitchen, the griddle still sizzled. At some table, a fork scraped against a plate. But the usual murmur of conversation had died down. People watched. They waited. Bukele studied the young woman's face. There was no hostility in her expression, only determination, as if she had already made up her mind, or perhaps as if someone else had made it for her. Her gaze strayed to the kitchen window. Behind the counter, two cooks watched the scene from the gloom, their faces inscrutable. She cleared her throat. "Excuse me, have I done something wrong?" The young woman did not hesitate this time. "It's just that we prefer not to serve you tonight. It's not a restaurant policy. It's not because we're about to close. It's just that." Bukele dropped his hands on his hips and exhaled through his nose. He had been in many uncomfortable situations before, heated political debates, interviews designed to trip him up. But this was different. Being turned down in a simple roadside restaurant carried a different weight. A throat clearing broke the silence. Bukele turned his head slightly and caught the gaze of an older man sitting at the bar. He appeared to be a lifelong customer. His blue work jacket had worn cuffs, and his weathered hands told the story of years of labor. He shook his head, more to himself than to anyone else, before digging his fork into the last remnants of his breakfast. A few seats over, a woman shifted uncomfortably in her chair. her expression impossible to read. Across from her, a younger man, perhaps in his 30s, leaned back with his arms crossed, as if enjoying the show. Bukele noticed it all, the glances that strayed as soon as they crossed his, the ones that lingered a little longer than necessary, with something sharp in them, something more akin to satisfaction. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He had choices. He could simply walk away, shake his head, and let it go. He could demand an explanation, point at them, ask them if they had any idea what this would look like in the headlines the next morning. He could openly challenge them, see if they would actually stand firm in their decision when they realized they were denying service to the president of El Salvador. But he did nothing of the sort. "Okay," he said, in a calm voice, nodding slowly. "Can I talk to the owner of the place?" Some people looked surprised. The young woman behind the counter hesitated again, casting a quick glance into the kitchen, as if silently seeking permission. The older man at the counter muttered something under his breath. Someone near the window let out a brief chuckle, as if he couldn't believe Bukele was actually doing this. He just stood there, waiting. The young woman disappeared again, this time through a different door. The silence grew thicker. There was only the sip of coffee from some customer, the sound of a plate sliding across the counter. Then the door burst open. A man in his 50s stepped out. He was stocky, thick-armed, with a grease-stained apron crossed over his chest. His nameplate read Don. He didn't ask what Bukele wanted. He just looked him up and down once, then spoke. "I was told you have a question," but the way he said it was neither welcoming nor polite. It was a challenge. Bukele held Don's gaze, serene, revealing nothing. He wasn't there to argue. He wasn't there to demonstrate power. But neither was he going to leave without understanding why he was being treated this way. "Yes," Bukele said calmly. "I want to know why they won't serve me." Don exhaled loudly through his nose, as if he had expected the question, but still didn't feel like answering. He wiped his hands on his apron, taking a quick glance at the customers who were following the scene attentively. Some pretended not to be listening. Others didn't even try to hide their curiosity. "Look," said Don, shifting his posture. "This is not personal." Bukele arched an eyebrow. "It sounds pretty personal." Don's jaw tightened. He rubbed the back of his neck and finally let out a sigh. "People here have opinions about you, about what you stand for. I have a business to run and I don't want any trouble." Bukele nodded slowly, letting the words settle. "And me sitting down to eat is a problem?" Don didn't answer right away. His gaze slid to the bar where the older man in the blue jacket had returned to his plate, chewing more slowly now. A few seats over, the younger man still stood with his arms folded, surveying the scene with a satisfied smile, as if this was the best entertainment of the night. Bukele had seen this before. Not exactly like this, but enough to recognize the pattern. It wasn't just about a decision. It was about what it meant, what it would look like, how people would react. It was about the ripple effect, about the pressure coming from all sides, about the silent expectations that could push a person to make decisions they weren't even sure they agreed with. She looked at Don again. "Be honest with me," Bukele said, in a firm but calm tone. "Are you really okay with us, or are you just trying to keep the peace?" Don hesitated. His fingers closed slightly against his apron, and for the first time, Bukele saw something that almost looked like discomfort, as if perhaps Don wasn't as sure about this as he wanted to appear. But before he could respond, the young man in the back seat let out a laugh. "Come on," he said, shaking his head mockingly. "This isn't that deep. You're just not welcome here. It's as simple as that." Bukele turned his head and watched him for a moment. He looked like the kind of person who enjoyed a good fight, someone who had been waiting for an excuse to talk. But Bukele didn't take the bait. Instead, he looked back at Don. "I have no problem leaving," he said, his tone serene. "If that's really what you want." The words hung in the air. He was giving Don a chance to breathe, to reconsider, to resist the pressure that had brought him to this moment. Don averted his gaze to the kitchen, then back to Bukele. "I just don't want this to get ugly," he said at last. Bukele nodded slowly. "Neither do I." For a long moment, neither spoke. Bukele could have walked away. He could have shaken his head, walked out the door and not looked back. He could have made a phone call, turned this into a headline, let the internet do what it does best. But instead, he did something no one expected. He pulled out a chair, sat down and said, "So let's talk." The air in the cafeteria changed. The tension thickened. Bukele didn't throw the chair on the floor. He did not puff out his chest or raise his voice. He simply sat, resting his hands on the table, as if he had all the time in the world. The restaurant was not used to this. Confrontations usually ended quickly, with one side storming out or shutting down completely. But this was not the same. Don looked at him for a long moment and then exhaled slowly. "Speak," he repeated, as if the word made no sense in this context. Bukele shrugged his shoulders. "You don't want me here, I understand. What I don't understand is why. So let's talk about it." From the seat in the back, the young man laughed again. "This guy's got guts." Bukele ignored him. Don pulled the chair in front of Bukele, but he didn't sit down. He leaned against the back, arms crossed. His apron still had traces of flour from the morning. "I run a business," he finally said. "I'm not looking for trouble. I don't want headlines, but I have a community to worry about." Bukele nodded. "That's fine. So tell me, what does this community think about me?" Don looked over his shoulder as if he was waiting for someone else to answer the question for him. The waitress behind the counter shifted uncomfortably. The older man in the blue jacket kept his eyes down, but his fork hadn't moved in a good while. Then Don looked back at Bukele. "The people here don't like politicians. They don't trust them. And some of the things you've said, some of the things you stand for, they just don't go down well." Bukele leaned back slightly in his chair. "That's fair enough, but tell me something. You don't know me, do you?" Don hesitated. "No, not personally, no." "Then tell me," Bukele continued, "if I were just an ordinary man walking through that door and not someone you've seen on TV, would we be having this conversation?" Silence. Bukele let the stillness stretch out, watching Don's expression subtly change. It wasn't a complete change, but something was broken, however slight. From the back of the restaurant, the young man's voice interrupted. "This isn't about television, man. It's about people knowing who you really are," the young man interjected, with a cocky grin, as if he had finally gotten the attention he sought. Bukele turned to him. "And who am I?" The young man leaned forward, enjoying the moment. "You're the guy who says he understands the common people, but in the end you play politics like everyone else." Bukele nodded slowly, considering his words. "Okay," he said, unperturbed. "So tell me, what do you think I should have done differently?" The young man blinked. It was not the answer he had expected. "Do you want me to leave?" Bukele continued. "That's fine, but you have the floor. Say it, whatever you need to say." The restaurant was completely silent. Even the kitchen had stopped. There was no sound of dishes clattering, no orders being taken, just expectation. Don sighed, running a hand over the back of his neck. "This is not what I was expecting tonight." Bukele smiled slightly with a tired air. "Neither did I, but for the first time, the tension didn't feel like an irreconcilable divide. It felt like something more, something closer to an attempt to understand each other. The restaurant was no longer just silent, but attentive. Even those who pretended not to care were now peering sidelong over their plates. Bukele waited patiently. The young man, still leaning back in his seat, seemed to want to say something. But for the first time, doubt crossed his face. Perhaps because he realized that Bukele was not arguing. He was not defending himself. He was just waiting. Don, still holding the chair in front of him, finally let out a sigh. "You want to know what people think? They think you're a phony." Bukele did not react immediately. He just tilted his head slightly, as if considering his words. "They think you talk about the working class, but you keep playing the same old game. That you make promises like any other politician in a suit. But when it comes down to it, nothing changes." Don exhaled through his nose. "And people don't forget." Bukele nodded slowly. "I understand." The young man let out a sarcastic laugh. "That's all you're going to say?" Bukele turned to him. "What else do you want me to say?" The young man straightened up in his seat. "I don't know, man. You're supposed to argue, but to defend yourself, to say something. Bukele rested his forearms on the table and stared at him. You had already decided what you thought of me before I walked through that door. You wanted me to get angry. You wanted me to fight so that you would feel justified. The young man opened his mouth but said nothing. Bukele continued, his voice serene. But tell me something. What if I told you that I know exactly what that frustration feels like? He turned to Don. You said nothing changes. I know that feeling. I grew up in it. I watched people around me get left behind. I felt it myself. And yes, I studied. I did things no one expected me to do. But that doesn't mean I've forgotten. Don's fingers drummed against the chair. His expression was inscrutable, but he no longer looked so skeptical. Bukele scanned the cafeteria with his eyes. They don't have to agree with me. I didn't come here to change your opinions. I came as a customer, not as a politician. Just a man looking for a plate of food. A tense pause. Then from the bar, the old man in the blue jacket muttered, "It is a shame that a man can't even eat a hamburger." The air in the restaurant broke just a little. Some people smiled sideways. Even Don let out a slight chuckle, shaking his head. Bukele turned to him. So, what now? Don exhaled heavily, running his hand over his face. He glanced toward the kitchen, where the cooks were still attentive. Then he looked back at Bukele. If you stay here and finish this conversation, and in the end I don't think you're just another guy talking pretty, maybe, just maybe, I'll ask the waitress to bring you a menu. Bukele smiled sideways, an amused twinkle in his eye. Sounds like a fair deal to me. For the first time all night, the atmosphere no longer felt divided. It no longer felt like a confrontation. It was something different, something closer to a conversation. The mood in the cafeteria had changed. The stiffness in Don's shoulders had softened, if only a little. The young man in the seat at the back was no longer smirking. He had straightened up now, instead of continuing to lean back as if this were a show. Even those patrons who had remained silent, watching from a distance, seemed less sure of their own judgments. Bukele leaned forward slightly. Very well, he said in a calm voice. Let's finish this conversation. Don exhaled heavily and finally dropped into the chair across from Bukele. He looked tired, but not the kind of tiredness that comes from a long shift of work, but the tiredness that accumulates over the years, the weight of expectations, of feeling that the world doesn't listen. He rubbed his hands together and said, I'll tell you the truth. I don't know if you're the guy people think you are. I don't know if you really care about people like us or if you just know how to speak well. Bukele nodded slowly. Fair enough. Don studied him silently for a moment before continuing. But I do know something. People here have memories. They remember every promise made to them. Every time someone shook their hand, looked them in the eye, and told them they would do something for them, only to walk away and never come back. Bukele rapped the table with his knuckles softly, thinking. Then he said, I don't blame them for that. Don let out a dry laugh, shaking his head. That's the problem. No one ever does. A heavy silence fell over the place. From the bar, the old man in the blue jacket broke the moment. I worked 35 years in a factory. 35 fucking years. He set his coffee cup down on the bar with a thud. I watched my neighbors lose their jobs. I saw whole families pack up and leave because there was nothing left for them here. I saw politicians come over, shake our hands, tell us they understood, and then get in their cars and go back to where they came from. Bukele held his gaze. And you think I am one of those politicians? The old man looked at him for a long moment before shrugging his shoulders. I don't know. He paused, then raised a calloused finger and pointed at Bukele. But I'll tell you what, you're the only one who stayed to listen. That dropped like a stone in the cafeteria. The waitress behind the counter shifted uncomfortably. The two cooks in the kitchen looked at each other. Even the young man in the back seat, who had been the most critical, had nothing to say now. Bukele let the silence settle. Then he looked at Don again. So tell me, what are we going to do? Don drummed his fingers on the table, looked toward the kitchen, and let out a long exhalation. Finally, he stood up. Mary, he called to the waitress, bring him a menu. A murmur of surprise rippled through the cafeteria. The young man snorted derisively, but did not argue. The waitress, Mary, hesitated only a second before taking a laminated menu and carrying it to the table. Bukele took it with a slight nod. "Thank you." Don looked at him, half amused, half incredulous. "I still don't know if I like you." Bukele smiled and opened the menu. "It's okay. I don't need everyone to like me." Don let out a short laugh before turning toward the kitchen. "All right, boys, fire up the grill." And just like that, what started as a rejection became something no one in that cafeteria would ever forget. The tension didn't disappear entirely, but it had dissipated enough. Enough for the forks to clatter against the plates again. Enough for the murmur of conversations to slowly begin to rebuild. Bukele settled into the seat with the menu in his hand, but he wasn't reading it. He was watching Don, watching the old man at the bar, watching the young man in the back, who still looked skeptical, but was no longer smiling mockingly. Mary, the waitress, appeared with a cup of coffee. She said nothing. Bukele took a sip and arched an eyebrow. "It's strong." Mary gave a faint smile. "We always make it strong here." From the kitchen, Don was still watching him. He still seemed unsure what to think of Bukele. Finally, he shook his head and went back to the grill. And so, what started as a confrontation ended in something different. In a coffee shop in a random town, on a random night, a group of people allowed themselves to listen rather than fight. And sometimes, that's enough.